It's funny having run this show for what's gonna be 9 years soon. God, I can't believe this is my life. I make predictions at the future, and then I see whether or not they actually play out. Something that's really horrifying is that in a lot of different cases, it's even worse than I imagined it would be. A little over 2 years ago, I made a video about how World War III would play out today and who would win. However, in the time since, history as it has happened has totally changed my view on this topic. I still completely respect the opinions I said back then, since they were reasonable, but things have since been proven to be different. However, the possibility of war still hangs over all of us. This is a video to look into the topic and see what would happen if the bloodiest war in history were to take place in our time. Who would win, what would the front lines be like, and more. The answer might control the fate of our lives. Despite all the talk of drones and robots, conventional warfare is still mostly fought with tanks and planes, the most reliable weapons of war. These are excellent machines, and now you can take command of them in the epic online game War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle war game ever made, with more than 2,000 different planes, tanks, helicopters, and ships that you can use in the most epic combined-arm PvP battles. Every vehicle is completely modeled down to its component parts with designs from the 1920s to the present. What I find especially cool at this game is that there are no hit points, the vehicles take damage to their crews and parts, thus creating a really immersive experience. I really enjoy War Thunder and has a lot to offer on multiple platforms. Stay tuned to the end of the video to hear about the special promo for my viewers only. This video isn't going to look into the causes or probability of having a major war. I already have a video about that. With this video, we're just going to start with the assumption that war has already started, and then we'll see what happens from there. The Chinese have a large alliance structure that encapsulates the region of the former Mongol Empire. Their biggest ally is Russia, as well as the Central Asian states and Iran. A point we'll tease out here is that this is a pretty weak alliance, all things considered, only built around dislike of the American world order. The Russians and Chinese, by all accounts, ought to be enemies more than allies. They nearly fought a war 40 years ago, and there's a significant branch of Chinese nationalists that literally want to conquer Siberia. At the same time, Muslim governments are trying to form their own caliphate and don't really like the Chinese, given they're genociding the Uyghurs. However, since they share a common enemy, that being the Americans, they are working together. The American coalition is the European Union, or America's allies in NATO, and the countries around the Asian Rim, like Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, India, the Gulf Arabs, Turkey, Maritime Southeast Asia, and Oceania. This has more ideological unity than the Chinese coalition, since there aren't as many squabbles over shared borders, and they have a common democratic system and fear of China. There's no one in the American alliance structure who looks like they want to declare war on anyone else in it. Interestingly, you can overlay the former Mongol Empire or treatment of women 200 years ago with the current borderlands of these two alliances. I'm not here to talk about what could start a war like this. There's a ring of fire around the Asian continent, including Ukraine, Syria, the Chinese-Indian borderland in the Himalayas, Pakistan, or Taiwan. However, there are some things that make me very, very worried. The first thing is that China has literally done everything it would do if it were to invade Taiwan. They stockpiled several years of food, oil, iron, and all other necessities. They literally said they were going to invade Taiwan, and they massed their army and naval forces to do so last year. They also pushed anti-American and anti-Indian rhetoric to a fever pitch where they told their nation, literally, to prepare for war. It's kind of funny where I and a friend who's a CEO who runs a geopolitics consulting firm predicted that the Chinese would attack Taiwan last spring because all of it just added up, but then they just didn't. The US military thinks China is aiming to attack Taiwan sometime around 2025. Also, I'm shocked Pakistan has not experienced a civil war yet. I've heard that prices for basic stuff like food, oil, and more have gone up 4 to 10 times over in the area around Pakistan. They had horrible flooding last summer, which I also expected to break them, but again, I was wrong. I don't lie to you on this show, and I like to say that this job of predicting the future is betting against God, given there are about a million ways to be wrong and only a handful to be right. If we want to continue this topic, me and 3 other people who do this kind of predicting professionally thought that there would be a financial crash last November and October independently. I guess we're either wrong, or this is the era of the cheapest money ever, has resulted in processes that basically have to happen, are taking longer than people would expect, operating off a historical precedent since we're the outlier. However, where this is leading me is, let's imagine an example where China invades Taiwan and or Pakistan falls into a civil war which India intervenes in, thus provoking a war with China. For the sake of the scenario, America also gets involved in this war, even though I don't think that's a given. And then, what happens after? I don't think a nuclear war is on the table. I explain why in my video on nuclear war. However, the Chinese only have 300 nukes while the Americans have 6,000. The Chinese literally have a no-nuke policy, and given they have 4 times America's population and a significantly larger industrial base, means that they're incentivized to wage a conventional war. Meanwhile, the US will not want to genocide hundreds of millions of Chinese unprovoked. And also, the US is so geographically removed from the main area of war that things won't get real enough that it has to go for nukes in order to keep itself safe. I also don't think Russia would get involved in the war. This is something I've changed from the previous video. As said before, Russia and China are not strong allies, and the Chinese really have not supported the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine. A reason some people have for this is why the Chinese did not attack Taiwan like people expected was that they thought the Russian invasion of Ukraine would win within a month, which is what almost everyone thought, and the Russians very embarrassingly didn't and are still fighting the war. At the same time, the Middle Eastern front, with countries like Iran and Russia's allies such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and more, they're not close enough with the Chinese to start a war with them over this. This is not to say the Middle East won't have wars for other reasons in the near future. Especially coming potential agricultural crisis could cause incredibly horrible wars in this area, but it won't be pushing a Chinese agenda. This means that this war will be constricted to the eastern half of Asia, which, don't get me wrong, would still easily make it the bloodiest war in history by several times over, but is less of a world war and might in a couple centuries or years be called the Chinese War or the Great Asian War. This would fit in a lot of ways since in its stage of industrialization, nationalism, and demographics, this eastern half of Asia is in a very similar position to how Europe was during its world wars. The first is in Korea, where the Chinese are allies with the North Koreans. In sheer number, China and North Korea are 2 of the top 3 largest militaries in the world. Thus, a truly massive weight of human flesh would smash down the Korean peninsula. The land between the North Korean border and South Korean capital of Seoul, which is a mega city, is a dead flat plain, which would thus probably turn the city into a wasteland and a Stalingrad-like horrible meat grinder of house-to-house warfare that might even determine the course of the war. I think the South Koreans could hold on, moving their capital to Busan in the southeast, due to their skinny peninsula, mountainous terrain, superior weapons, training, military doctrines, and having American troops on the ground. The American military strategy, which our allies also share, prioritizes firepower, which is the best tactic for a defensive campaign, thus meaning that I think South Korea would survive. You have to remember that this is a country that has fought off around 10 Chinese invasions so far in its history. One of the things that's really shocked me at the Ukraine war, which is a great view of how modern wars might be fought in the future in the same way the American Civil War or the Russo-Japanese War were ways to figure out how World War I would be fought, is the war in Ukraine's not fought that dissimilarly to World War II, which is absolutely nuts because if you look at the history of modern warfare, periods like 80 years will almost always see incredibly rapid shifts in how wars are fought. But my understanding of the war in Ukraine is it's still similar tactics to World War II, with tank offensives and infantry fighting. And, for example, I thought drones or rockets might completely revolutionize the battlefield, but it seems to have not. On the other hand, trying to predict military technology is up there for founding new religions for jobs that are most difficult to do right. The precedent for predicting how future wars will be fought is extremely bad. The best technique is often just to believe the opposite of what the consensus view is. And I mean, I guess that's how things worked out, because the consensus among futurists and thinkers was that the next war would be purely push buttons, with drones or fought remotely, while the reality is that the war in Ukraine, or similar wars in Armenia, have been very much conventional on-the-ground wars. Next we move on to Taiwan, which the Chinese have clearly marked as their big centerpiece, and even largely the reason for the war. They see it as the reconquest of their lost province. This war brings out all sort of fascinating new technologies. I've heard the Chinese have the ability to jam satellite signals, blacking out the South Chinese Sea of American surveillance. Also, the Chinese have massive amounts of rockets and bunkers along the South Chinese coast to deny Americans access to the Taiwan Strait. One of the biggest and most profound shifts in my thinking on this war, since the last version of this video, has been my rapid collapse in respect for Chinese institutions. I don't think the Chinese would be able to take over Taiwan, which I said they would easily do in the last video, simply since I don't think their military or organizations are capable enough. In the last video I said it would be a toss-up on how effective the Chinese military might be, and it had the potential to be very effective. However, when I made that video at the end of 2020, the last thing we heard about China was that they had dealt with COVID very efficiently. That wasn't that funny. However, right now the tables have really turned. China is barely a functional country today. I legitimately believe and would bet good money that they will have a massive revolution over the next 5 years. You can see this in their COVID lockdowns, in which they shut down internal trade, thus resulting in millions of people going hungry and close to starvation, in not letting farmers grow their crops or welding people into their homes. You can see lots of indirect evidence for incompetence that ranges between an inability to actually execute these COVID lockdowns in any way to a uniform fashion across China, or from what we've seen significant amounts of the stockpiles they've been trying to make to prepare for whatever crisis they expect are often rotting, unusable, or just not even there. I'm not saying America's perfect here, but the Chinese are in much worse condition than America, in my opinion, and also more is expected of China because they have to wage an offensive war while the US largely has to wage a defensive one secondarily through its allies. In a society, the normal level of social functioning is broadly indicative of how well the military works. You can find no countries with extremely dysfunctional cultures and amazing militaries, or vice versa, since the military is a representation of the society. Also, it's not like the People's Liberation Army was ever considered a beacon for efficiency and fairness. Selling officers commissions is a decently common thing, as is them having their own massively bloated military-industrial complex that makes ours look great. The Chinese Navy has gone on a massive building binge that you'll get these incredibly embarrassing stories of Chinese crews being completely incapable of manning or sailing the ships, or them being maintained in horrible conditions. The final thing you need to wage war is to be able to feed young men ideas that make dying for their country worthwhile. However, China also fails here. Xi Jinping, China's leader, has been trying desperately to move China back to Maoism, as he modestly calls it, Xi Jinping thought. This involves kicking the foreign journalists out of China, preventing Chinese from studying abroad or studying foreign languages, and turning China's educational system to prepare young men for war and propagandize them, and have women make children. However, it's going to be impossible to turn the Chinese back to communism after they've seen capitalism. Communism is not that powerful in China. What the Chinese generally want is a strong and prosperous China, and nationalism is a much more potent tool. Xi is almost certainly trying to move back to Maoism, given he imagines there will be a Korean War-like terrible conflict, or at least a major crisis, and he wants the Chinese to act with fanaticism and carelessness for life that they had under Mao. However, communism's vigor as an ideology has been completely spent. Everyone knows the communist utopia is not going to happen except for delusional academics. With all this going on, we've seen China fall into riots, with the largest since Tiananmen Square. The average Chinese person lives a not great life, often in an apartment the size of a horse stall, working 12-hour days with no chance to have children or save up for old age. I'm not saying the West is an especially good place either. The West is doomed to mass social instability. However, it will not be as bad or as soon as it will be in China. China can't afford to wage a long and bloody war since it will simply have another revolution. Also, China's demographic problems, in which it has far more old people than young people, means it can't afford to lose lots of young people either. And also, If a single Chinese man dies, his entire ancestral family line is dead too, and as a culture that cares as much about family as China, that's going to be crippling for their social model and create mass discontent. Another factor is that the Chinese don't have the ability to ship oil and food by land, which they need. The Americans are the most powerful navy in the world and would blockade China, and that's the only Chinese route to get oil from its sources in the Middle East is overland. However, we live in an era in which a giant food crisis is approaching, which will result in making Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, all the areas in between them and the oil, incapable of hosting a Chinese rail line. At the same time, this would require one of the greatest engineering projects in history that the Chinese have not yet completed. The Chinese only have a couple years to fight this war before their food and oil supplies run out. However, that assumes the Chinese will be able to wage this war efficiently, which they probably will not. This will create conditions like Russia in World War I, which was also experiencing horrible resource shortages, which also caused a revolution. One of the things I've just recently come to terms with is that the crisis of the 21st century has more to do with traditional social structures breaking down due to societal pressures than any real aggressive force, and this is going to happen everywhere in the world. However, this will mean that all the Chinese's main offensives, including Taiwan, will be failures. Taiwan is incredibly small compared to China, but there are a couple important factors that can allow the Taiwanese to survive. The first is that amphibious invasions are incredibly difficult in the modern world and have only been successfully done a handful of times, in each case under extremely positive odds for the attackers, which the Chinese would struggle to get in Taiwan due to US support. The Chinese military is also very skilled, and the island is mountainous, jungly, and urban, which is the worst climate to fight in. Each of the major border zones the Chinese would fight in are horrible terrain. This is largely since the Chinese conquered everything good in their temperate zone until they hit a rough borderland. In my last video, I said the Chinese would be able to conquer Vietnam through using their allies in Laos and Cambodia to surround it. It's kinda ironic how America and communist Vietnam are now strong allies, but they are. However, now, I don't think the Chinese will be able to pull that off, and they would lose in Vietnam. This fits in with the theme of the Vietnamese fighting off 27 Chinese invasions over the last 1,000 years. Finally, the last borderland is India, where if war does break out, it would possibly be the biggest and bloodiest war in history by a significant margin. India and China added together have more people than the whole world during World War II, and both countries are prone to using human wave tactics. However, this would involve the Chinese vaulting their forces over the Himalaya mountains. These are the highest and most difficult mountains in the world. If the Chinese would be able to vault over these mountains, it would be the most impressive construction project in the history of the world. It's always hard with China since they're pretty secretive, and I am sadly not privy to all their secret documents, but they were attempting to build a road system to do this a couple years ago, which they didn't finish. Since they are massively pressed, I do not think they are about to complete the most ambitious engineering project in history. The reason I thought it was conceivable in the previous video is that around 2020 they had incredibly impressive construction abilities that we have not since seen them use. Instead, we'd see them attack India through the jungles in Assam. In this harsh terrain, the Indians would have a clear advantage and win, resulting in the death of millions of Chinese. Lowland jungle environments naturally benefit the Indians, who come from a lowland tropical environment, against the mostly temperate Chinese. Thus, we're looking at a war with the Chinese launching large human wave attacks ineffectively in harsh terrain, before being defeated by the local populations as aided by the Americans. This is a movie we've seen a couple times before, to say the least, with just the easiest examples being the Korean War and the Chinese invasions of Vietnam. However, this kind of invasion, in which a large Chinese army fights ineffectively and is chewed up by harsh local terrain, has occurred too many times to count over history. This includes, just for a handful of examples, the 18th century Chinese invasion of Burma, the medieval Yuan dynasty invasion of Japan, the 7th century Sui invasion of Korea, the 16th century invasion of Mongolia, or the 15th century invasion of Vietnam. In each of these wars, massive, poorly supplied, led, and trained Chinese armies were wiped out by much smaller native forces. The final front in this war is Pakistan. Pakistan is one of China's strongest allies and hates India. thus meaning they would likely try to get involved on China's behalf. The train line between China and Pakistan is extremely difficult, and so the Chinese would not be able to send large armies to Punjab. Pakistan and India have already fought several wars, which India has universally won easily, and India has advantages over Pakistan in everything, and this gap has just grown over the last couple decades. I've said before that Pakistan's ostensibly a mess, and I am completely shocked that they have not fallen apart as a functioning country by this point. However, they would be unable to maintain the shock of a war with India, and even be able to feed their population, honestly. I could see the Hindu nationalist government, which is in charge in India, and has been looking to reunify the subcontinent, conquer Pakistan up to the Indus River, which has been India's natural boundary for most of its history, and then they let the Taliban take the rest of the country. This leads to the next point where, as I said in the previous video about if we'll have a world war, that if we have a major war now, it won't be like the previous world wars of 100 years ago. Something like the 30 Years' War or the 100 Years' War makes a lot more sense. In the previous world wars, they were fought by energetic, very young, demographically industrializing countries. In situations like this, societies almost act like rockets, just pushing out, fighting very aggressive wars. World wars are demographic ejaculations. However, the similarities between what a war would be like in our times and the 100 or 30 Years' War is that they are fought by countries going through demographic crises, which I talk about in these videos. They were fought by countries facing the same problems we have now of high inequality, political polarization, social collapse, or economic hardship. These aren't societies bursting with energy, but rather ones that are desperately waging wars in order to maintain their internal social stability. In both the 100 Years' War and 30 Years' War, all the major countries involved were fighting civil wars by the time the wars ended. If we fight a major war in our time, it will be like this. I expect every major country in the equation, whether the US, India, China, Pakistan, and the others, to have a major internal crisis that will pull them out of the war for part of it. A war of the one-eyed. The 100 Years and 30 Years' War are less based off giant Götterdämmerung battles like Stalingrad or Verdun, and more so about gradually trying to break down the other side's ability to fight and wage war economically or socially at all. For example, the English government's inability to pay its debts in the 100 Years' War during the 14th century caused a financial crisis that broke the European economy, and the exact same thing happened with the world's economy and the Spanish in the 17th century. A situation where the US or China defaults on its debts, resulting in an economic crisis, sounds a lot like the sort of thing that could happen in our time. What the equivalent of that economic warfare fought in these previous eras would be is cyber or satellite attacks, both of which have the potential to cripple large parts of society if done correctly. In the modern world, people are completely dependent on giant supply trains and on extremely complicated systems, and if those break down, people will start to starve, and people won't be able to get the proper medical care they'll need. If a country can wipe out its opponent's satellites, it can drive them back decades and wipe out communications on the most basic levels. Another similarity in the 30 and 100 Years' War is that they were so long since they weren't a single war, rather 3 or more distinct wars being brought together under a single banner, and every single geopolitical player was involved in these wars. This is the sort of thing that can happen in the modern world due to demographics. Our similarities with these earlier crises is that we have the exact same kind of demographic crisis in which our populations are collapsing. These crises take decades to work out as countries try to fight out the new order. The horrible thing of our age is that every major country in the Northern Hemisphere, including Russia, China, the European Union, and Japan, with the exceptions of the US and India, are projected to have their populations go down by over half over the next few decades. This means these countries are going to be fighting a long crisis and a source of instability for a very long time. Meanwhile, Africa and the Middle East are totally dependent on foreign food imports, which can't possibly be maintained, thus creating the firewood for another kind of horrible demographic crisis, one of mass famine. The short answer is that this war will not be as intense as a world war, but similar to other demographic stagnation wars like the 100 Years' War, crisis of the 3rd century, fall of the Roman Republic, Napoleonic, or 30 Years' War, all of which were fought in different sections over a period of decades. Short answer, expect your sons, and hopefully not your grandsons, to have to fight in the same war as you. I guess the positive is more girls for you if you survive. Sleep tight tonight, boys. Remember to check out War Thunder, the most impressive vehicle combat game available on Xbox Series X and P, PS5 and PC. Plus, anyone who registers on PC gets a free bonus pack, premium vehicles, premium account, boosters, and more. So try War Thunder today and use the link in the description to get a free bonus pack featuring vehicles and boosters. What a Feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please stay tuned for future content, like, comment, or subscribe. Alternately, check out my Instagram, Twitter, or other socials with the link in the description. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day.